Right. I think we are live. Good morning, everyone. Hope your week is off to a great start. Excited to talk more about what concurrency has been doing in the M&A space with our customers and how we are leveraging technology to help organizations meet a myriad of different goals through these types of projects. I'm going to give us about another moment, then we'll get started. While we are waiting for everyone, I'll just go ahead and pull up for those of you that have not attended these webinars before, which I do recognize a number of names that are in attendance right now. But for those that are new to concurrency and kind of what we do, and even who this guy is that's talking on the other side of your screen, I'm a solutions architect here on our Modern Workplace team at Concurrency. I've been here for almost 9 years at Concurrency. I've been in the Microsoft consulting space pretty much my entire career, over 20 years now. It's been fun kind of seeing how the advent of cloud has really evolved, how we've been able to use Microsoft 365 for collaboration, to be able to move identity, security, email, endpoint management, all to that cloud solution. It's really been exciting to see how the Microsoft space has really taken a big lead in terms of the cloud, not only from each of these technologies in that modern workplace space, but also in some of the involvement that we've seen for things like AI as well, which you may have seen some of our other webinars around AI as well. If not, definitely check them out on our YouTube page or go to concurrency.com for more information on that. Got a couple of links here of my own for my LinkedIn. I've got a blog that I've been maintaining for over 20 years as well. That's hard to believe that someone's been blogging for 20 years. Well, I'm one of those guys. So without further ado, give people an opportunity to wander into the meeting. Let's go ahead and get started in talking about M&A and technology. That's really why we're all here today, to kind of see how they are a winning combination, because M&As are not easy. As we like to say, they are one of the most stressful projects that an organization will do, because it really does impact everyone, not only from the users, but also IT up to leadership, etc. We won't go into the details around things like integration management offices or organizational change management in this particular discussion, but maybe in a future one, we'll kind of circle back around and talk about how, from a business process side, we can look at how those types of thought leadership processes can help to really drive success and efficiencies around M&As as well. But as we look at technology and the goals of M&As and how we use technology, there's really 5 goals that we try to instill within customers to have their leadership all the way down to IT and their end users really kind of embrace to see how they can be more successful. And the key one is reduce that time to value, and using these tools makes the integration process quicker. By using integration and technology, we can be non-disruptive for production. That is probably the biggest goal of an M&A, is to have the least amount of impact as possible, because these will have some impact. I cannot tell you that an M&A and technology will make it non-impactful, but we want to try to make it non-disruptive. So that's goal number 2, probably the most important one. Number 3, mitigating security risks. As organizations are transitioning, as users are transitioning, there's a barrage of communications that go to users. They're going to get asked to do certain tasks, certain things, set up MFA, etc. And so this is a time where usually users are bringing their guard down a little bit. We want to mitigate those risks through the use of security tools. And at the same time, as we're going through and executing, and I'd say probably another really important task with technology is to modernize. Let's take a look and see what processes and what technology maybe we want to replace with new and exciting processes, and we'll take a look at a lot of scenarios here in a few minutes that allow us to modernize with technology as well as being able to gain efficiencies. Why do the same thing and the same processes and the same technology over and over again if this is giving us an opportunity to do more and to do better with the technology that we have at our disposal? So those are our key goals with technology. And then as we complement M&As with technology, what we have seen is the organizations, the customers that have embraced the new and modernized technology as part of these projects, they've been the most successful. As well, in thinking through their architecture, they may have opportunities to modernize that as well. That is usually the first step, is understanding what's in your environment before we can take those next steps down into actually doing integration. We want to plan that M&A approach that uses the technology, as well as being able to keep in mind that we want to really steer away from anything that is more legacy, because traditionally we found is that will usually slow down the process. And so as we think of those goals and the North Stars, as we like to call them, of an M&A, we really look at kind of 7 key areas as we are working with our customers. We want to accelerate how fast we can integrate, and using technology can do that. We want to simplify that user process, and talking about identity as the core. We'll get into some of the options with the Quest tools that we'll talk about, and how we can simplify that process based on not only the technology side, but the human capital, the HR side as well. We'll look at those commoditized technologies in the Microsoft space, from Entra ID join and Autopilot, and being cloud managed with technologies like Intune. Those commodity tools are going to help us to achieve that end state a lot easier, a lot more secure, as we're combining those organizations, being able to move away from any on-premises dependencies. Again, being modernized and moving away from legacy will help us achieve that quicker. Having a streamlined and simplified security tool set is also a huge opportunity as we start to look at licensing, looking at vendors. Those are areas that if we can consolidate, it's going to make not only that process smoother, but also make it where we have less vendors potentially that we have to manage as we're transitioning into an organization. And then change management, which I did mention, we won't cover any of those within this conversation, but being clear to your end users as you are making those transitions are key to an M&A project as well. So that first step, after we, usually as we're engaging with customers, one of the areas that we like to introduce, especially with customers that are in this cycle of acquisitions, they may do anywhere from 1 to 5 a year, which we do have customers that do that, as they're going through and really building out what that M&A machine looks like. That's where we introduce the concept of the migration factory and the T-shirt sizing. As we look at the directional phases when it comes to an M&A, there's usually these 5 key phases. And establishing that migration factory is very key to the success, whether it's going to be one merger, one divestiture, one acquisition, or maybe it's going to be, as I mentioned, multiple per year. Having a defined process is going to help make that go smoother. All of it usually starts out with high-level planning, whether it's 1 to 5 a year, whether it's just one at all. Being able to go in there and understand what's in the environment is going to be critical to understanding what that end state is going to be, because we're going to have to plan on moving all these different components, and we'll talk about the different work streams here in just a second. But then as we start to then determine if we're building a new environment, if we're integrating into a new environment, if we're adopting new technologies as a part of that process, we have to understand what that delta is going to be, or what efforts are going to be needed in doing that work. So as we go through and do that plan and build, there we define tasks that have to occur. Those defined tasks will usually have 2 levels of impact. It's going to either impact our modern workplace team, it's going to impact our end users in their email, how they share files, how their PCs are managed, how they're making phone calls, or if they're using traditional PSTN. And then the second component is going to be the data center, and that usually will encapsulate things like your servers. Are you going to move your servers? Are you going to modernize those as well with Azure PaaS or IaaS services? What are we doing with file shares? How are we managing our applications, our SSO? These are key important things that come into play when we start to do the planning. And then finally, that last phase is one that's really new to the M&A story that we tell, is really cleanup. Is even if we are merging or divesting, there's always going to be that concept of making sure that objects are cleaned up, domain names are moved, licensing, tenants. There's a number of different components that come into play from a technology perspective that have to be considered when we look at these directional phases. Usually a lot of this will happen by way of pre-discovery as we start to work with organizations. Some of them have a due diligence process that they have already followed. Some of them will bring us in during that due diligence process, which I think honestly will lend to the greatest level of success at the end of the day, because we're able to kind of come in throughout this process. And while the organizations are usually doing some of that business due diligence, we can come in and do some of our what we call t-shirt sizing to help look at the technology within the environment prior to the ink drying on the paper, before access is given into the environment. There's still some work that we can do to be able to take a look and see what's in that environment. And then as we go through and start to do some of that t-shirt sizing, this concept of looking at the modern workplace strategy, the endpoint strategy, the data center strategy really do start to come front and center. And so, if we think of each type of integration project would be like a different size. This one can be a small, this one can be a large, this one can be a really big one that involves a large data center estate. Those are usually the ones that would be like an XXL, for example. But as we start to take a look at these areas from a t-shirt sizing exercise perspective, that allows us to then paint a picture to see, what does it look like to move their modern workplace environment? What does it look like to manage and move devices? What does it look like from a data center perspective? What does it look like to help support that the customer in each of the organizations as they come together, or potentially even divest? Being able to build out this t-shirt sizing will have us being able to avoid a number of different things throughout the project, from items being missed, roles being defined, tools being set up, being able to manage users and lists, which we'll talk about towards the end of this conversation today, and how to be more efficient with that. Misalignment, communication, and going on and on and on. There's a lot of benefit to being able to come in from day one with this concept of t-shirt sizing, to be able to understand what that end game is going to look like and have a vision even before we start to touch some of the technology within the environment. And speaking of technology, usually as we go in and talk to customers, as we start to do some of that planning, there are a number of key decisions that really will drive that technology end state behind all of these M&A projects. As we think about the concept of integrations or divestitures, we have to think about, at the first step is the planning. Before we even execute a project, that planning, we have to understand how vast of an impact it's going to be. And usually these are those 6 core areas that we look at as we go through in an integration project, and be considerate of the work streams that are involved to have a successful project at the end of the day from an M&A. And as we look at each of these areas, we can usually break these down into some of those, the migration factory, as we looked at the different phases. As we look at phase 1, we can see there's usually quite a significant amount of security and identity work that is involved. And we can see how that scoping really does across all the different work streams in that phase 1, as we start to plan, as we start to gather data, build out that integration plan, we are looking at all of these work streams, understand what the breadth of that project is going to be. As we go into phase 2 and 3, that's where we start to see the end user impact, trying to be non-disruptive, moving all their email, moving their computers from source to target. And then as we are going through and executing that collaboration in user computing, we're then also going in and we are starting to do the work around the data center and the applications, because it's usually easier once users are in that target environment to move applications, servers, without it being very impactful on the end user. Now, IT, that's a different story, but that's where we want to use technology to do that as effectively as possible. And as we go in and start to do some of the discovery within an environment, as we start to do discovery across all of these different work streams, there's a lot of insight that we need from not only our identities, our email, our servers, and potentially database infrastructure, SANs, cloud data, users and groups, etc. Being able to wrap our arms around all of this data can be really daunting. And so this is where we use technology that's at our disposal. We are a partner with Quest. We'll use a tool like their Enterprise Reporter that we can go in and really capture all of this data and then be able to understand the quantity of how many users and groups are we going to be moving, being able to have a picture of where potentially we may need to do cleanup, because this is a great opportunity with all these projects to go in and clean up what's in the environment that's not being used, that's old, that needs to be archived, as well as be able to understand the data and what potentially may need to be excluded. It's very possible as part of a divestiture project that we only need to carve out a very small piece of the data. And so being able to have a full picture is going to be able to help us understand what we need to carve out. And then likewise, as we are doing, as organizations are doing acquisitions, being able to paint a picture of the breadth of all the data is very helpful to be able to quantize what that plan is going to be, what goes into that migration playbook, so to speak. And then, being able to look at each of these different data discovery points from not only cloud, but also to your servers, your file servers, your SQL servers, being able to have this at one place at your disposal will then help be able to really build out what that plan is going to look like. And as we go in and we look at integrations, those plans usually involve a number of different data points. We're at Concurrency, as we engage with these projects, we do have a set playbook and a set steps that we are executing alongside with customers. There are decisions that need to be made on both sides as to what that plan is going to look like. But the goal, as we mentioned at the beginning of this call, this is a great opportunity to transform. And by having that plan in place, we have a guide that we can take throughout that journey of integration. And so as we think of technology in that regard, we'll start to look at a couple of slides here for the next few moments that really kind of walk us through where there are a number of those decisions that have to happen as we do these integration projects. Typically, day one, once this merger is started between two organizations, this is where we will typically see that both sides want to collaborate more effectively. And so from a Microsoft 365 perspective, it's not too uncommon to see both organizations have that as their tool set. This is where we then start to establish those organization relationships, make it where they can email easier back and forth, and then start to plan on how they can collaborate better. What we want to try to avoid is a lot of rework and a lot of extra work because of how big these projects are. By avoiding some of that duplicated work, by having a plan in place, we can do things like having to avoid setup guest accounts or contacts, which I've seen in a number of integration projects. Those are things we want to avoid by having the right technology and the right plan in place from an integration perspective. But collaboration-wise, we can make that a lot easier for users on both sides to work together. And as we start to look at some of the tooling, there are a number of options out in the marketplace for migrations, for integrations. There's the Microsoft tools that we've taken a look at, and there's definitely viability behind them, but they are not as mature as some of the other tool sets that are available in the market, like the Quest tools, which is why we use them predominantly here at Concurrency, is because they are mature and they touch all the ends of an integration project. And I'll talk a little bit about the Quest tools in a minute, but I want you back up that fact with what it can actually do today, because there may be opportunities where with the Microsoft tools you might just be moving email. That's great. Doing cross-tenant migrations is something that it can do, and you can do it without any cost. Once you start to look at things like SharePoint, you can move that as well through some of the free tools that they have. Looking at the ability to do cross-tenant migrations, that does come at a cost. So, it's only available as well for the Microsoft 365 Enterprise customers. They have to add it on as an additional subscription for the migration across the two tenants. But then as we start to look at what some of the limitations are on the SharePoint migrator, or AKA the legacy mover, there is file size limitations, there's permission limitations. So it's not as powerful as some of the other tools, like what the Quest on Demand can do or what a ShareGate can do. The same thing with the Exchange cross-tenant migration. There's a lot of pre-work that has to go into not only managing and setting up the identities, but also the migration of those users itself. It does do it quickly, which is nice because it is all internal to Microsoft, but there isn't the flexibility that you have of being able to provision a user in that new environment and have them start being able to work in it as well. The other thing as well that I don't have listed on here is their cross-domain support. And Microsoft has kind of been working on that in waves. I think some of their larger enterprise customers, is something that they have been able to support, but it's not something that you can easily leverage to be able to have a user in one organization and be able to email out in another. And so that's where some of the Quest tools come into play, which we'll talk about here in a second, can help to facilitate that. So as we look at those tool sets, it does allow us to not only migrate and manage, but also even doing things like pre-discovery. They've added some really nice reports where I can go in, I can connect into a target environment or a source environment. I can run a whole bunch of reports to be able to help do some of those efforts that the things like the enterprise reporter can do. So a lot of capabilities and just being able to connect into that tenant to know how big the SharePoint sites are, how many team sites there are, how much OneDrive data or Exchange is there, how many user accounts are within the environment. A lot of that pre-discovery we can do very easily with the Quest tool to help us be able to plan out how big that migration is going to be. And as I mentioned before, being able to have that flexibility in building out that migration plan, having the maturity of the tool sets and the supportability. That's one thing that I can't stress enough. It's how easy, even as myself, as someone who is certified in the Quest tools, there's always going to be those small little questions that come up, being able to reach out to them and then be able to get an answer really quickly, getting to a subject matter expert. There is a lot of value when it comes to executing migration, being able to quickly access someone that has that subject matter expert level of expertise on the Quest side to answer those questions in any of these areas. That in itself almost is paying for itself in that value of the licensing from the Quest side as well. So as we go in and we look at the tools, we've talked about Microsoft and Quest, there's others in the market, but one of the things that we then start to really drill down into each of those technology areas is how do we handle email coexistence? If I have a user account, the source, and I'm moving them over to a destination tenant, and I still need to be able to email out as oldco.com. How can I do that if my email account's in a tenant with newco.com? That's where we can look at tools like Quest's domain rewrite capabilities to be able to facilitate that capability of being able to email out versus leveraging things like a webmail or having to email out as new company, but you're getting email in from old company. It gets really messy. And so that's where that SMTP integration and the domain rewrite are very nice because from day one, whether that's inbound or outbound, you can have a unified, cohesive brand experience, being able to be able to email out as that new organization or even that old organization. You have that control per object to be able to control what the flow of email is. There's a number of connectors that live within the Office 365 tenants to be able to facilitate how that emails out and what your email address is during the course of an integration project. So what your brand looks like as an end user is very important throughout the course of these projects. And then at the end of the project, how do you facilitate moving your domain names? There's a number of options too, where we work with customers as they are, in some cases, they're doing a divestiture. In cases where this would arise, they have a new UPN going into a new tenant because source.com is in that environment, and we can't use it until every user, all their documents, all their SharePoint sites, their OneDrive is all moved over. Unless those objects are cleaned up in the source, we can't move that domain over. And so there's some being able to leverage tools like the Quest domain move as well is another one that we can leverage alongside of their domain rewrite. So while email is still flowing out through the respective domain names throughout the project, at the end of the project, we can make it really easy to be able to transition those domain names over into that new environment as well. And then as we start to think about it, in some of these cases, this is where, as we've worked with divestitures, organizations that are spinning off and starting up their new organization, there's usually some domain name considerations that have to happen. From what do they want their new domain name to be in the Microsoft world? What is their tenant name going to be? Their vanity domain name? What do they want their users to log in with? From a UPN perspective, how are we going to handle their email addressing from a rewrite perspective? What is Active Directory going to look like? These are all decisions that are key as we're planning out that environment, as we're leveraging technology. These are technology decisions that have to be considered as you are transitioning into a new, divesting. Usually in an acquisition, the organization is going to adopt what is in place, but these are some key decisions that we've worked with customers to consider as well. So aside from the domain name, now let's start talking about computers. Let's start talking about Office 365, collaboration. How are we going to move those? And in working with customers, there are scenarios where they have opted to go through either refreshing machines or they want to just move collaboration, which is totally doable. But typically when there's that disconnect from my email, my Office 365, and my computer, and if I only do my collaboration, at some point I'm still going to have to manage migrating my computer. And there's still going to be that level of disconnect from an operational environment because my computer is in a domain that's in my old Active Directory, and my collaboration is in a separate domain that has my device. And so that can cause some user confusion and some user pain as well as they're trying to access resources, which is why as we go in from a combined workstation migration approach, we have found that even though it does have some initial prep and a longer initial phase, it's going to lend to a better end user experience at the end of the day. And so this is one consideration as we start to plan out how migrations are going to occur. We start to then think about how we actually are going to migrate those PCs into that target environment. And I'll be honest, there's 3 options here, but all 3 of these actually can be used throughout the course of a single project. It's very common where we'll see in an integration project, there'll be some group of users that have older hardware and it's just easier to give them a new device. There are going to be others where maybe there's in storage or spares of hardware for your users. It just makes sense to do a workstation reset and maybe autopilot all those into the new environment. But typically what we found is if we can move an end user's device into a new environment, a new domain, and keep it to where when they come in the next day, all their icons are at the same place, all their applications are there, all their files are there, it's going to make that end user experience that much easier and going to have a better impact on the users and their view of this transition as well. And so that's where we use tools like the Quest on demand to be able to move them into the new environment, and then also look at being able to transition them from a traditional hybrid join desktop directly into Entra ID join, aka traditional Azure AD. Now being Entra ID, there is a capability to move it to be fully cloud managed. The machine is then modern managed. It's more secure because it's not in a traditional Active Directory domain. You don't have to worry about a device, being tombstoned or legacy. There are a lot of values to going to that modern managed approach as well as part of that transition, because then you're leveraging zero trust methodologies. You're leveraging best in class tool sets, like you're not having to deploy a complex on-premises management tool set and then still connect it to the cloud to be cloud managed. Gone are the days, it seems almost, where we're working with customers to deploy cloud managed gateways and SCCM environments. Is just so complex, and it's very burdensome to have those traditional management tools when tools like Intune have that same capability and allow you to have kind of that best in class tool set from a capability perspective. So thinking through the collaboration migration process, thinking through the PC migration process are very important as well. By looking at kind of that modern managed process, we can avoid the whole traditional IT experience. So this is taking us back to the being thoughtful about how can we improve our technologies through these migration processes. We can improve our IT teams workloads and how they would deploy machines, or potentially how they would refresh machines if something happens where a machine needs to be rebuilt. In a lot of cases, traditionally, you'd have to ship it to a corporate location or come to a location that's close to you. But in the advent of work remote and work from home, that's becoming less and less realistic from an end user support perspective. Plus, having to go through image machines, get it shipped to a corporate location, put an image on it, ship it back out is overburdensome. IT does not have to do that anymore, especially when they can look at something like an autopilot managed process where as an IT admin, I can have a machine drop shipped to a user's location. They turn it on, they start the provision process, and then within an hour or two, not only is their device modern managed and zero trust, but it's connected to autopilot and Intune. Their applications can stream down, and then they're ready to work. So it's not only easier for IT, but there's less of an infrastructure as well. So this is a perfect scenario when it comes to your devices, where this is a great opportunity to modernize that experience. And then as we start to look at some of the tool sets that live within our environments, that live on our machines, this is where thinking about what existing licensing and disparate tools may be within your environment, and where potentially looking at moving to the Microsoft 365 E5, being able to streamline and strengthen that tool set will allow you to have better best-in-class tools without having multiple vendors that you're working with to be able to have those security and compliance tools within an environment. And so this is a real life example of a customer. Actually, several customers have that we're working with have a very similar tool set in their environment. As we start to look at where we can have maybe 4 or 5 or 6 or etc. of vendors within your environment, this is where we could look at something like Microsoft 365, either E3 plus E5 security or full E5, to be able to help improve visibility and threats and being able to close some security gaps, and even being able to leverage some of the AI tools that are coming out through, Copilot for security, Copilot for Intune. Those were where we can use some of the tools that are within that E5 stack to be able to have a single best in platform approach versus maybe a best in breed approach. And so this is where, looking at some of those tool sets, we can use consolidated security to improve threat protection, being able to look across the estate to not only be able to protect our users, but protect their data in the cloud, protect servers in your environment, even protecting some of your hardware that may exist in manufacturing space through things like IoT. These are all scenarios where threat protection, in boiling that down into one single tool set, is going to include and improve your security posture and give you additional insights that you might not have had with traditional tools as well. And then as we start to look at threat protection features, there are a number of third-party tools like Qualys and SecureWorks that are typically layered on top of a tool like a Carbon Black, that you're then looking at multiple different tools to help you close those security gaps, when you can extend that capability through Microsoft Defender by adding on things like vulnerability management to be able to have a number of these premium capabilities, to be able to do things like look at your security baselines, look at vulnerable applications. One of my favorite, browser extensions. I can look at browser extensions that are deployed across my estate that not only live in Chrome, but also Edge. So if there are extensions that I want to block in the environment, it makes it easier for me to see where those are within my estate. Being able to look at maybe expired digital certificates to be able to see where I might need to do cleanup from that regard. Looking at things like network shares, being able to even get reports on versions of firmware and hardware. So if my network printers or my laptops have an older firmware version, I have all that reporting capability built into M365 without having to have a separate bolt-on tool. And then as we start to look at where a lot of different states and different industries are becoming more and more regulated, being able to have some of that tool set through E5 or E5 compliance to be able to do things like records retention management, being able to do labeling. Those are important as well. Being able to do e-discovery where it's needed, being able to even look at things like insider risk, which is it's a growing area that there are great tools through E5 compliance to be able to look at how my users are communicating, being able to set up barriers between different parts of business units where they are legally required to do so, being able to look at the risk score of a user to see if their behavior is changing, and using AI to be able to potentially prevent them from accessing resources without it being too late and someone already having exfiltrated data outside of your organization. All these are great scenarios as we're thinking about an M&A, where we can look at technology and see if there might be something better, or be able to make that change as users are in that process of change and IT is in that process of change, being able to leverage those better tools from an IT perspective. And this is a great opportunity to do that as well. And so as we were talking with customers, there's usually a couple of scenarios that they're looking at from a licensing perspective. And I always love to share this because it's a little bit of a black box in terms of what do you do when you're doing an acquisition or a divestiture. And there's really those three core scenarios. And I can add licenses to an EA if I'm acquiring a company. If I am a smaller organization, I can do it through a CSP. And in some larger organizations where we're working with customers, they have an enterprise agreement. This is where they can then initiate what's called a bridge agreement. So then licenses live in both tenants for a period of time. I can then say, okay, I'm acquiring a company. There are 500 users. I don't want to have to pay for 1,000 licenses for the course of 3 to 6 to 12 months. Microsoft is usually very gracious in letting you have that bridge agreement. So then licenses live in both environments through the course of that migration. And so being able to have that flexibility, not only with Microsoft side, is definitely a time saver when it comes to migration and integration as well. Looking at voice, this is a great opportunity with these types of projects to move away from a traditional phone system, because in a lot of scenarios in talking with customers, those desk phones have been sitting there and no one's been using them for a long time because of the advent of Teams meetings and headsets. And your end users are typically leveraging those to connect with customers and with each other instead of making traditional PSTN phone calls. So this is a great opportunity really to scale back on your phone footprint and be able to leverage a tool like Teams. it's a great opportunity to look at servers and being able to see which ones of those may or may not being used, or maybe they are outdated. It's very common where customers will be on older versions of Windows. And this is a great opportunity as they're looking across the estate to scale back in some of their resources. It gives them a great opportunity to look to modernize how they're using file shares as well, and potentially moving those from those traditional file stores or NASs into something like Azure files, because in a lot of cases, most collaboration is being done in platforms like SharePoint and Teams. File shares are maybe traditionally where you've got some legacy information that you want to keep around, but you don't want to keep a file server around to do that. So it's a great opportunity to look at your file estate. It's a great opportunity to look at potentially how you might be leveraging services or resources like remote desktop. And we have a number of customers that have aging remote desktop farms, and they want to do something more modernized. They want to be able to get more flexibility. They don't want to have to manage a server infrastructure to do that. So moving to things like Azure Virtual Desktop, or maybe Windows 365 PC, where it becomes more commoditized to spin up and spin down versus scaling out from a server infrastructure. So having that personal desktop or that virtual desktop approach is very convenient as well. And as well, looking at network topology, that's a really big component of a merger and acquisition, or even a divestiture, is understanding your network and being able to look at how you're going to take those resources and potentially shift them to the cloud. That usually will require some integration with Azure as well, to be able to build out those new managed networks, to be able to build out a proper Azure landing zone where you're putting resources like your management network and your identity resources and your servers and anything customer facing. Those are great opportunities from a networking perspective to look at micro segmentation as well, to make it where your networks are more secure. And then at the end of the day, as we think about all of these different decisions, they're usually going to be they're going to be a part of that planning process, that process from how we're going to execute, not what steps are we going to execute, is usually where we work with customers to sit down and build out their specific M&A playbook. And then as we engage with them to build and to actually perform the migration, that's where we'll then work with them to build out a run book, especially with customers that are on that annual cycle of a couple of acquisitions a year. Having the tools in place and the technology refreshed, as we talked about through each of these decisions, and then having a repeatable process that staff can use to execute these processes adds a lot of value from a technology perspective when it comes to leveraging and executing a merger and acquisition. And then as we look to really build out that M&A playbook, usually looking at an integration schedule, so a high-level project plan, so to speak, which is then accompanied by a project plan of actual run book and execution steps, are important to leveraging technology to look at each of these different areas from a modern workplace perspective, which we can see in the work stream at the top, and then a data center perspective that we can see at the work stream at the bottom. All of these are part of that full integration story, and being able to have that playbook to help spell that out, and being able to have made those decisions from a technology perspective are all important as well. So let's talk a little bit about the technology. Let's look at how we can leverage technology to make that migration process easier. So we talked about Quest. We talked about why Quest, because it's a more mature tool. It's got great supportability, but it's also really easy from day one to be able to come in and connect your tenants together, to be able to do a discovery, to be able to have reports, be able to do data sync, all from one pane of glass, and not have to have multiple tools, one for your email, one for your identities, one for your computing. There's a lot of value to having one single tool set. Excuse me, this one tool set allows us to then take a look at those foundational components. First one being identity, being able to have a workflow that will allow us to ensure that identities not only that are on-prem, excuse me, but also in the cloud in Azure or Entra ID are synchronized, that the Quest tools allow us to do that as well. And this is a real live workflow of a customer scenario and how it looks at Workday to understand if there are active employees, if those employees or objects are in Entra ID only, which typically we find with like shared mailboxes or other resource mailboxes or other type of service accounts. Those are all identity components that are important and will need to be either integrated or migrated as part of that identity orchestration. So having a great tool and a great process that can ensure your success in identity is typically the very first step. And then from there, looking at collaboration tools, being able to make sure that your data from your email boxes is moved over into that target environment as well and operate the same way as a traditional Exchange hybrid migration for those of us that have been in IT a while, that first made those moves from traditional on-prem Exchange to the cloud using that mail replication service. This is very similar with the Quest tool sets where it just looks at that first initial copy of your data and then look at the incremental moves as well. The Quest tools, their on-demand suite have that ability to do that from a collaboration migration perspective. On the email side, let's talk a little bit about SharePoint because SharePoint is its own beast as well when it comes to Microsoft's APIs and throttling when it comes to SharePoint. I've seen it many, many times. Microsoft has their windows of time where they make copying data from these SharePoint environments a little bit quicker. But in a lot of cases, they have their own limitations, and Quest has to abide by those limitations so they don't get put in a throttling timeout when it comes to copying a lot of your data. So the tools have that ability to smart copy the data and being able to look at speeds and then understand if I need to slow down and be able to prioritize other users. Quest migration tools have that capability as well. They also have the ability to help us orchestrate that end user computing move and being able to, and this is another real world workflow of how we execute computer migrations. There's a number of steps that have to go into that process as well. A lot of those, especially as we start to think about identity, start to boil down to that wave planning process, which is as crucial as actually doing the migration itself, is knowing who needs to move and when they need to move, and do they need to move within groups? And that's how we do some of the wave planning and some of the organizational change management as part of these projects. And we've got a great technology tool to help facilitate that, which I'll talk about at the end. But being able to move workstations along the same time as moving our identity synchronization or collaboration migration is very important as well. And so it was part of that in any integration project. We're typically taking a look at the tool sets that live within the source environment that have been installed on a computer. And all these typically have to be removed as well. And then as part of this migration process, as we come back here to looking at the migration workflow, typically as we're going through at the time of migration, we're also going through and executing these steps as well. We're cleaning off a machine of their Intune configuration, any printer applications, the security tools, because as we're transitioning, we're modernizing and we're improving. So in a lot of cases, we're no longer using AD Labs. We're using Windows Labs, which is in Entra ID. We're using Defender for Endpoint. We're not using other tools. We're getting rid of SCCM. So there's a process of preparation from a technology perspective that we have to prepare our machines so that way when we do join them into this new environment, they're cleaner, all the legacy tools are gone, and they're ready for the end users to use as well. And so from a PC migration perspective, I'm not going to go through all the details here, but in using Quest on demand and being able to do the Entra ID migration, there are a number of steps that have to go on behind the scenes to prepare that machine to come from a source environment and move into a new target environment. Those typically involve some key processes like downloading user mapping files from Quest to say, okay, I know in the source environment, I'm this SID, and I'm in UPN, and in the target environment, I'm this SID and UPN. So I need to know that I need to have that mapping so that way I can update the permissions on my profile. I can ensure that autopilot has cleaned up and that Intune is cleaned up from the workstation. I can create a scheduled task that will make sure that end user's target UPN is set. It'll make sure that the BitLocker key has been escrowed to the new environment. It'll set the primary user in Windows. It'll clean up any local admin groups and then actually perform the cutover. So these are steps that you don't have to perform manually as part of a migration. And these all happen so quickly that within usually 20 minutes, the end user's machine is ready for them to use in the new environment versus having to spend hours rebuilding a machine and days, if not weeks, reinstalling applications, putting all your data back at where it was, reconfiguring all of your application settings, giving the end user this experience of migrating their machine into the new environment seamlessly is worth its weight in gold in terms of being able to save them those frustrations. And then afterwards, that day one is easier. They're going in after they have completed that migration. They can run this desktop migration agent as well now that their computer is transitioned, and then all their collaboration applications are transitioned as well, from their Outlook to their Office license to their OneDrive to their Teams. Quote, and then an asterisk, new team support is coming soon. It's not there yet. You still have to do that manually. But being able to deliver this experience to your end users silently and having it happen behind the scenes makes their life easier on day one as well. And let's take a look at now we've gone through that journey of an end user and what that looks like and some of the technology decisions to help make the M&A process easier. How do we make that M&A process easier for our IT teams, our business leaders, to be able to start doing planning around how does that migration process happen smoother to know who needs to move when? And so one of the things that we have been plagued with, and I'm not going to call Bill Daly out on the phone, but I'm going to call Bill out because he's lived this headache all of his life when it comes to working with us on the business process side at Concurrency and projects, but list management. I'm not sure if these are actual lists, but in terms of being able to look at what it means to go through and manage a myriad of different spreadsheets and know how and when to move users has just been an absolute pain. And so one of the things that we have realized that if we can make the wave planning process easier and build in technology behind the scenes to help it be orchestrated easier, that also adds value from an M&A process perspective. And so we have developed a tool called our Concurrency Automator that as we go into integration projects, even identity management projects that, working with customers that have done M&As and they're still fraught with different Active Directory domains and consolidating them because they walked in with a single collaboration integration approach versus a combined end-user workstation Active Directory domain approach. Being able to help them move these resources and being able to move PCs into Entra ID or make sure user accounts live inside of the target environment. Being able to empower customers to manage this process without having to send Excel spreadsheets back and forth and see them being becoming outdated. And the problems behind doing list management is something that we've strived very hard over the last year or so to have that tool set to be able to help us do that, as well as being able to not only control what waves that our end users are a part of, but being able to actually have some really comprehensive reporting to be able to look at our users across the environment. So being able to pull data from disparate Active Directory environments, disparate Office 365 tenants, being able to combine them into a single view. These Power BI reports really do help with some of our wave planning to make lives easier. And from a high-level architecture, the nice thing about the concurrency automator is it doesn't live in with the actual application. It does live in the concurrency environment, and then we've got a collection server that we'll usually leverage to pull this information. But when it comes to the actual data itself, you as a customer own that data. That data lives within your tenant. We simply provide a front end to be able to interface with that and all of the logic to be able to help use all the data within your environment to be able to help with planning. So we covered the whole gamut of how decisions around your technology are going to help make an M&A process better, and at the other side of an M&A, make it where you have streamlined and strengthened your IT environment. And we would love an opportunity to connect with you. If you have an M&A that you're planning, if you are considering creating your own M&A playbook, or maybe you have a playbook and you'd like for us to kind of take a look at it based on our best practices that we've established, we'd love to connect with you. We'd love to help with any M&As and taking our experience over the last, I want to say 6 years that I've been in Concurrency doing integration projects. It's been fun seeing the technology evolve. It's been fun working with our amazing team to help evolve our processes, and we want to put that to work for you. So if you have an M&A project that you're thinking about, definitely reach out. Amy has dropped a link in the chat of not only the survey of what you thought of this presentation, which I'd love to see, but if you have any projects that are coming up, not only from an M&A perspective, but maybe you just want to streamline and strengthen your technology stack on Microsoft 365. Maybe you'd like for Concurrency to come in and kind of take a look at your tools and maybe even help you put together an action plan around these specific areas where maybe you have 5-10 different vendors that you use for your security. It's not even uncommon to see customers have 5 or 10 other technologies that they use just in their endpoint management. I did another webinar through the Microsoft 365 user group here in Minnesota just around Intune. But those are all great opportunities where we'd love to connect with you and help you navigate through your technology stack and potentially help you not only save money with some of that licensing, but also help your IT teams save time as well. So in closing, we're here to help. We definitely would love to connect with you. Please feel free to go through and fill out that survey link that's in the chat. And then Chris Pratinga, great to have you on the call, asked a really great question about acquisitions that are G Suite targeted. And I didn't go into detail on this particular call, but we have the experience with the Quest tools as well. Quest bought Metalogics a few years back, so actually they have a whole tool set that you can use to move data from G Suite and integrate that into your Microsoft 365 environment. And from the perspective of even doing some of the native email moves out of Gmail into Exchange, Microsoft has actually really awesome tool sets with their Exchange migration tools when it comes to the email, and then being able to leverage a tool like the Metalogics migrator as well can help to move all the data that's in the Google Workspaces, in the Google Drives, being able to have that singular story. We've got experiences there too. Chris, you know how to get a hold of me. If you want to talk further, I'd be happy to help you with that in terms of being able to take non-Microsoft tools and have those integrated into your Microsoft stack. So I do have a few more minutes. If anyone else has any other questions, if there's some slides that they want to see any further, happy to be able to show you those. In terms of kind of I think probably one of the other key slides that I always love to show from a technology perspective really is kind of this one here, and being able to show all the different Quest tools and being able to move them, not only for the ones that are Microsoft, but there's a lot of cases too where there's other scenarios outside of just the collaboration and user computing, that there's a number of Quest tools when it comes to your data, enhanced security, a lot of them within that stack as a Quest partner, we definitely would love to kind of sit down, and even if you're not doing a merger and acquisition, there may be some opportunities to look at what some of those tools can help to do to help support just even management. They have a really in-depth, not only Microsoft management stack, but if you have a number of database platforms, things like Oracle, Microsoft SQL, non-SQL, that you're looking to wrap your arms around. They've got some great management tools for those. But in terms of being able to use that Quest on-demand migration and kind of their 5 key areas, from not only being able to do some of the project management for workload assessment, helping with client updating, but then also discovery, migration, and coexistence. They've got some fantastic tools that really do make life easier when it comes to M&A projects. So that said, I think we're right at time. Definitely please fill out that survey. Would love to hear what you thought of this presentation, and hope to be able to connect with you and your M&A project again soon. Have a great day.